I've seen too many boat owners spend a few bucks on a cheap windlass and end up wrestling with a jammed anchor line after a day on the water, wondering why they didn't just invest in something a little more reliable. The regret that follows those budget-first purchases usually boils down to wasted time, a stranded boat, and a dent in the wallet when you finally have to replace the whole system. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. So the question I'm tackling today is whether the Maxwell RC10 812V automatic rope chain windlass feels like a smarter buy, or if it's just another piece of equipment that sounds good on paper but leaves you hanging when you need it most. First, let's set the scene. A windlass is the heart of any anchoring routine. When you're pulling in a 5/16" CH chain or a 5/8" rope, you want something that bites in and doesn't stall halfway through a pull. The Maxwell RC10 is a 12-volt electric unit that claims to handle both chain and rope, and it comes with a factory-installed breaker, a helm-mounted switch, and a solenoid. Those three components are the practical bits that most budget options skip, and they matter the moment you flip the switch while the boat is rolling in a current. If you're the type of boater who drops anchor in calm bays once a month, you might get away with a manual crank or a very cheap electric windlass that only handles a single size of chain. But if you spend your weekends cruising the Gulf, heading into windy coves, or you run a small charter that needs to set and retrieve anchors quickly for multiple guests, the Maxwell's dual-size capability starts to feel like a real advantage. The ability to switch between a smaller 5/16" CH chain and a thicker 5/8" rope without swapping out the entire unit saves you both time and the headache of carrying a second windlass on deck. What I really appreciate about the RC10 is the built-in breaker. In real-world use, you'll sometimes catch the chain or rope at an odd angle, especially if you're anchoring from a moving boat. That can cause the motor to stall, and a cheap windlass without protection will simply burn out. The factory breaker acts like a safety valve. It cuts power the instant the motor draws too much current, preventing the motor from overheating. I've heard boaters talk about the dreaded smoke scenario with low-cost units, and the breaker eliminates that risk. The helm switch is another piece of practicality that shows up in everyday use. Rather than crawling over to a deck-mounted control box every time you need to raise or lower the anchor, the switch sits at your steering position. In choppy conditions, you can keep both hands on the wheel and still control the windlass with a single flick. That small ergonomic benefit translates into smoother anchor handling, especially when you're dealing with a sudden gust that could push the boat off position while you're trying to get the chain back on board. On the flip side, the RC10 isn't a miracle machine. The motor's 12-volt rating means it draws a respectable amount of current, so you need a healthy battery and a solid wiring plan. Boats with a marginal battery capacity might see the voltage dip noticeably when the windlass runs, which could affect other electronics for a brief moment. If you're on a small outboard-powered runabout with a single 12-volt battery, you may want to double-check that your system can handle the load without draining the bank. In practice, a lot of owners pair the windlass with a dedicated auxiliary battery, which adds cost but solves the issue. Another subtle trade-off is the rope-to-cane conversion. The unit accepts both 5/16" CH chain and 5/8" CH rope, but you have to manually change the drum configuration when you switch mediums. That isn't a huge hassle, but it does add a step you won't find on a single-purpose windlass that's set up for one size only. If you're planning to stick with just one type of line, say, you only ever use chain, then you could potentially find a cheaper, single-size model that skips the conversion mechanism entirely. The Maxwell's flexibility shines when you actually need that flexibility, but it does mean a slightly longer setup time before each outing if you're swapping gear. Now, who should put this windlass on their boat? In my view, the sweet spot is any vessel between 16 and 30 feet that already runs a 12-volt electrical system with a decent battery bank, and whose owners value speed and safety in anchoring. If you run a small fishing skiff that only needs a manual windlass, you're probably overpaying. On the other hand, a 22-foot cruiser that regularly drops anchor in windy conditions, or a light tourism charter boat that needs to turn around guests quickly, will get real mileage out.